9 years this man let his wife pay every bill. 9 years of dead weight. You're not a soldier, you're a joke.
Nothing to say? Didn't think so.
Are you sure you want everyone to see this? I want the whole world to see how powerless you are.
The night I lost everything was the same night I stopped pretending. It was North Star Aeronautics' 25th anniversary gala, black tie, open bar, 300 people who believed they were celebrating a company's legacy. Investors, defense contractors, retired admirals, the kind of crowd that judges a man by the cut of his suit before he opens his mouth. I wore the wrong suit. Lauren had picked it out herself, an old navy blazer I'd had since before we married. "Just blend in," she told me that morning, not meeting my eyes. "Don't make tonight about you." I didn't argue. I never argued. I showed up, stood in the corner with a glass of water, and watched my wife laugh at Preston Vale's jokes from across the room like I wasn't there. I had known about them for 11 weeks. I had given her every chance to tell me the truth. That evening, before the speeches began, I sent her one last message. "I only need you to be honest with me once." She read it. She put her phone face down on the table and ordered another drink. I had my answer. What I didn't expect was Preston deciding that a quiet ending wasn't enough. He was 3 drinks deep when he grabbed the microphone from the MC's hand. The room went quiet the way rooms do when someone dangerous takes the floor, not out of respect, but out of instinct. Preston looked out at the crowd, smiled, and then looked directly at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room." He waved me forward. When I didn't move, 2 of his people appeared at my sides and walked me up to the stage. She was standing near the front of the crowd, 300 people watching. She reached up, pulled off her wedding ring, and pressed it into my hand. "Preston can give me a life you never could," she said. The room was completely silent. Preston reached over and tore the Navy badge off my lapel, the one I'd worn to every formal event since I was commissioned. He dropped it on the floor like it was a coat check ticket. He said men like me were good at telling war stories to hide the fact that we'd failed at everything that actually mattered. Then he slapped me across the face. I didn't move. He leaned in close. He said things about the men I'd served with, men who weren't there to defend themselves. Then he hit me again. I looked at the camera at the back of the room, the one that was streaming live to North Star's external feed. I asked him very quietly, "Are you sure you want everyone to see this?" He laughed. "I want the whole world to see how powerless you are." I reached down and turned the ring in my fingers, a small, precise motion. Then I hit him once. Preston Vale left his feet crossed 6 feet of open air and landed on top of a catering table. Crystal and silverware scattered across the marble floor. He didn't get up for several seconds. Security closed in from every direction. Lauren was screaming that I had lost my mind. Someone was already calling the police. I straightened my cuffs. "You want to know who I am?" I said to the room. "Look at the screen." Every light in the building cut out. And then they finally saw me. If you've ever felt invisible to the people who should have seen you most clearly, stay with me. This is that kind of story. And if it's the kind of story you want more of, subscribing to this channel takes about 2 seconds. We'll be here every week. People see what they expect to see. That's not a complaint. It's a fact I relied on for 20 years, and for a long time it kept the people I loved alive. In special operations, anonymity isn't a weakness. It's infrastructure. The moment the wrong people know your name, everyone around you becomes a target. So I learned to disappear in plain sight. Old car, quiet voice. A handshake instead of a biography. I became the kind of man people look past at a party, and I was good at it because I had to be. The problem is that eventually, The people closest to you start looking past you too. Lauren and I met 12 years ago, before North Star, before any of this. She was finishing her MBA at Georgetown, working nights at a policy think tank downtown. I was between deployments, staying with a friend in Arlington, and we ended up at the same poorly organized dinner party where neither of us knew the host very well. She was the smartest person in the room, and she knew it. I liked that about her. She liked that I didn't try to impress her. For the first 2 years, that was enough. I used my savings to help her finish her degree when her scholarship fell through. When her father got sick, I drove 3 hours each way every weekend so she could focus on work during the week. I turned down 3 overseas contracts because she'd just been promoted, and uprooting her wasn't something I was willing to do. I didn't talk about what I had done in the Navy. I told her I'd been in special operations, that my service record was classified, and that I couldn't say more than that. She accepted it. Early on, she even seemed to respect it. But respect has a shelf life when it has nothing visible to attach to. By the 4th year of our marriage, I had become, in Lauren's professional world, a liability. Not a threat, not a partner, a liability. I watched it happen the way you watch weather change from a distance, slowly enough that you keep thinking it might shift back until you realize the season has already turned. She stopped introducing me at company events. When she did bring me along, she'd say I was between projects or taking some time off. The word veteran disappeared from her vocabulary when she was talking about me. Too much explanation required. She had no idea that I was the reason North Star existed. After I left the Navy, 3 engineers I'd pulled out of a research facility in Eastern Europe came to me with a proposal. They'd been working on autonomous defense systems before they were taken, and they wanted to rebuild quietly with proper backing under the right kind of protection. I had contacts, I had capital from years of living on nothing, and I had a very specific understanding of what the defense industry needed and where it was failing. We built Aegis Meridian from a rented office and a shared server. Over the next several years, through trusts and intermediary funds that would take a forensic accountant months to untangle, we acquired 68% of North Star Aeronautics. I became its controlling shareholder without my name appearing on a single public document. I kept it from Lauren for 3 reasons. First, there were people who still wanted me dead. A weapons trafficking network that had lost a significant operation because of black tide had placed standing contracts on every identifiable member of my unit. Connecting Lauren to my real identity made her a target. Second, North Star had a leak. Classified hardware specifications were appearing in the hands of people who shouldn't have had them, and the breach was coming from somewhere inside the company. I needed to find it without tipping off whoever was responsible. Third, and this is the one I have the hardest time saying out loud, I wanted to know who Lauren was when she thought I had nothing. I had watched enough men get burned by people who loved their access instead of them. I needed to be sure. I was planning to tell her everything after the anniversary gala. I had already prepared a position for her on North Star's board contingent on the investigation clearing her. I had written out what I was going to say. Then, 11 weeks before the event, my security team flagged a pattern of access logs tied to Lauren's credentials. Vanguard files, the crown jewel of North Star's defense portfolio, an autonomous drone command system, worth several $1 billion in government contracts, were being copied in fragments. Small enough to look like normal workflow, frequent enough to constitute a full transfer. And around the same time, I started seeing Preston Vale's name in places it didn't belong. Preston came from old money that had mostly evaporated. His personal firm was carrying debt that would have buried most people. He survived on connections and a very specific kind of charm that works well on people who want to believe they're being chosen. He had joined North Star 18 months earlier, and within 6 months, he was in Lauren's orbit. I ran his background twice. What I found was a man who was drowning quietly and looking for a rope. What I eventually found, deeper in through channels that took time, was a man who had made contact with the network that had been hunting me since I left service. Preston didn't know I was a SEAL. He couldn't have. My operational record had been scrubbed from every accessible database. What he found when he investigated me was a faint trail, a few years of military service with no detail, and a shadow connection to a blind trust that held North Star shares. He thought I was a lucky civilian investor, a minor complication. He had looked at my file and seen nothing worth worrying about, because the parts of my file that mattered had been removed by order of the Department of Defense. He had no idea what he was walking into. He went after Lauren because she had access to Vanguard and because he believed I was nobody. He told her things about herself that she wanted to hear. He positioned himself as the future she deserved, and I watched her start to believe him. I gave her every opportunity to come to me first. The morning of the gala, I sent her one message: I only need you to be honest with me once. She read it, set her phone face down, and didn't respond. I put on the old blazer she'd asked me to wear, drove to the venue, and made peace with the fact that I was about to lose my marriage and begin something else entirely. What I didn't anticipate was Preston turning it into theater. He waited until the room was at full capacity investors' board members, 3 retired generals, a rear admiral I recognized from a briefing room I wasn't supposed to have been in. Then he took the microphone and made me the evening's entertainment. The photographs on the screen, the announcement about the divorce, the speech about what a failure I was, dressed up as honesty for an audience that hadn't asked for any of it. He'd been planning this for a while. Every word was calibrated. When he tore the badge off my lapel and dropped it on the floor, I felt something settle in my chest. Not rage, something quieter than that. The kind of clarity you get when a situation finally matches what you already knew it was going to be. Lauren handed me her ring. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me without flinching, which was the most painful part. She had made her choice before she walked into that room. Then Preston hit me. I absorbed it the way I had absorbed 100 worse things in worse places, and I stood still. He smiled like my stillness was submission. He leaned in close and said things about dead men who served alongside me, men who didn't make it back, using their sacrifice as material for a joke in a room full of people who clapped at the right moments. Then he hit me again. I looked at the camera at the back of the hall, the one with the small green light that meant it was live. 300 people in the room. God knows how many more watching the stream. I reached down and turned the ring between my fingers, a motion I had practiced until it took less than a second. A biometric trigger embedded in the band. A signal that had one name in North Star's classified security architecture. Black Seal Protocol. "Are you sure?" I said. "You want everyone to see this?" He spread his arms like a man who had already won. "I want the whole world to see how powerless you are." I ended the conversation with one punch. Preston hit a catering table hard enough to take it off its legs. The room made a sound I had never heard before, something between a gasp and silence, as if 300 people had simultaneously stopped knowing what to do. Security converged on me from 6 directions. Lauren was yelling. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was on the phone with the police. I straightened my cuffs, bent down, picked up the badge, pinned it back on. Then I said to the room, to the camera, to Preston Vale struggling to get upright 20 feet away, "Look at the screen." The lights went out. For 3 seconds, the grand ballroom of North Star Aeronautics was completely dark. Then the displays came to life. Commander Grant Ellison, Black Tide Special Operations Unit, Navy, Cross. 3 letters of distinction, Omega level security clearance. Below that, Founder Aegis Meridian Defense Group. Controlling shareholder North Star Aeronautics, 68%. The room stayed silent for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then, Rear Admiral Douglas Harwick, retired, decorated a man I had briefed in a basement in Bahrain 9 years ago, stood up from his table. He looked at me across the room, the way men look at each other when they share something that cannot be explained to anyone else. "Commander Ellison," he said. The head of security lowered his weapon. Then he turned to his team and told them to stand down. One by one, the directors who had been smirking at me 20 minutes ago found somewhere else to look. Board members who had voted on North Star's future without knowing I held a controlling stake absorbed the fact that I could remove all of them before morning. Lauren dropped her wedding ring on the floor. Preston had gotten to one knee by then. He was staring at the screen. He understood now why the file his investigator had produced was so thin. Not because there was nothing to find, but because someone had deliberately made sure there wasn't. He had walked into North Star's anniversary gala, assaulted its owner in front of a live broadcast, and handed me every legal and institutional reason I needed to take the company back. I looked at him for a moment. Then I spoke to the room. Effective immediately, no one leaves this building. North Star Aeronautics is under investigation for treason. Power means nothing without proof. That's something they don't teach you in business school, and it's something I had to relearn in the middle of a locked ballroom with 300 witnesses and a shoulder that hadn't been shot yet. The moment I announced the investigation, the room fractured. Half the people went quiet. The other half started talking at once. Board members pulled out phones. Security personnel looked at each other for instructions from a chain of command that had just been scrambled. For about 90 seconds, I had the floor. Then Preston found his footing. He had taken the hit well, I'll give him that. By the time I finished speaking, he was upright, jacket straightened, a controlled expression on his face. The panic I'd seen in his eyes when the screen lit up had lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then something else took over, something practiced. He raised his hand for the room's attention. "What you're watching right now," Preston said, his voice steady, "is exactly what this man wants you to see. A performance." He walked back toward the stage slowly, deliberately, like a man who had prepared for this. Grant Ellison has been using a network of anonymous holdings to surveil this company and his own wife for years. Tonight he provoked a physical confrontation in front of a live camera, then used a pre-staged display to reframe his own violence as a reveal. This isn't a whistleblower moment. He looked out at the board members. This is a man using corporate leverage to retaliate against his wife for leaving him. Then he nodded toward someone at the back of the room. A video began playing on the secondary screen to the left of the stage. Parking garage footage. Me, 3 months earlier, pressing a man against a concrete pillar with my forearm across his throat. It looked bad. I knew what had actually happened. The man in that footage had been following Lauren for 2 weeks on behalf of the same network that wanted Vanguard. I had identified him, intercepted him, and handed him to a contact at the Defense Intelligence Agency the same afternoon. But in the footage, without that context, it looked like exactly what Preston wanted it to look like. Some of the board members who had gone pale at the screen were now exchanging glances. Lauren saw her opening. She stepped forward composed, straight-backed, the same posture she used in quarterly presentations, and addressed the room. "Grant has never disclosed his ownership position to me. Not once in 9 years." Her voice didn't shake. "He has been monitoring my professional communications, my access logs, my movements. I didn't know. And now he is using everything he has accumulated to destroy my career because I chose to leave." She looked directly at the board chair. "I am asking this board to consider whether a man who hides this much from the people closest to him should be trusted with anything he is claiming tonight." The board chair, a man named Richard Alt, who had worked at North Star for 19 years, leaned over and said something quietly to the director beside him. I understood what was happening. Preston was smart enough to know he couldn't beat the credentials on that screen. So he was reframing the room's question. Not, "Who is Grant Ellison?" but "Why should we trust him?" I was about to respond when every security monitor in the building flashed red. The alert came from Sublevel 2, the Vanguard server room. A secondary team, not North Star's regular security staff people I had never cleared, had taken the room. They had keycards. They had bypass codes for the biometric locks. Someone had been preparing this for a long time. I looked at Preston. He didn't look at the monitors, he already knew. The scene on the stage had never been the operation, it had been the distraction. While I was standing under the lights being photographed and accused, his people had moved into position. The humiliation, the video, Lauren's testimony, all of it was designed to hold my attention and fracture the room's trust long enough for the data extraction to begin. I had maybe 20 minutes before Vanguard's source code cleared the building. I left the stage. Preston's team had locked the elevator banks and posted 2 men at each stairwell on the upper floors. On the main floor, 3 more had fanned out through the crowd, weapons visible now, telling people to stay where they were. Board members were being directed to one corner of the ballroom. A retired general I recognized was sitting very still with his hands on the table in front of him. Preston had stopped pretending. I moved through the service corridor behind the main kitchen and reached the secondary stairwell on the north side of the building. 1 man posted. I watched his pattern for 45 seconds, then put him down quietly and took the stairs. The 4th floor was dark, emergency lighting only. Preston's team had cut the standard overhead system to slow down anyone trying to navigate from memory. They didn't know I had memorized the floor plan of this building 3 years before North Star ever held an event here. The team leader was in the central corridor with 2 others. I recognized his silhouette before I saw his face, the way he held his weapon, the slight forward lean that told me he'd been trained in close quarters work. When he turned far enough for the emergency light to catch his jacket, I saw the insignia on his shoulder. A small black mark that looked like a manufacturing stamp unless you knew what it was. I knew what it was. He had been contracted through the same network that lost a logistics depot in Kandahar 6 years ago because Black Tide had gotten there first. He'd been on site that night, one of the few who walked out. He saw the badge on my lapel and stopped moving. His partner asked him what was wrong. He said very quietly, "Stand down." "He's 1 man," the partner said. "You don't understand." He took a step backward. "He doesn't need to be more than 1 man. This building is his weapon." He was right. I knew where the fire suppression zones were, which ventilation ducts ran parallel to the server room, and exactly how the emergency lighting system was segmented. I used all 3. I divided his team across 2 floors, moved through the gaps, and took them down one at a time. Short, controlled, efficient. No wasted motion, no unnecessary damage. It took 11 minutes. The people who had been watching through the security monitors in the ballroom saw it happen in fragments, 1 camera, then another, going still. By the time I reached the lower level, the corridor outside the server room was clear. I got a group of 8 employees out through the service exit and into the parking structure, told them where to go, and handed the most senior one a phone number to call. Then I went back inside. I found Lauren in the server room antechamber, alone, standing in front of a terminal with her access card in her hand. "Don't," I said. She turned around. She looked at me the way she had looked at me 9 years ago at that dinner party, like she was trying to solve something. But her eyes were different now. Exhausted. Scared in a way she was working hard not to show. "He said if I don't complete the transfer, everything falls on me," she said. "My codes, my logs, my credentials, it all points at me. He has attorneys ready. He already has a version of this story prepared." "I know." "Then you know I don't have a choice." "You had choices," I said. "You made some of them 11 weeks ago." She looked down at the card. "You were recording everything, logging everything. You knew and you didn't tell me." I was trying to find out how deep it went, whether you were a participant or a target. And I thought you were a target. I was preparing to tell you everything after tonight. She looked up. Something moved across her face that I couldn't fully read. "There's a recording," she said. "Preston played it for me, you and your attorney. You said you could remove me from North Star anytime you chose." I said I had the legal mechanism to do it. The rest of that conversation was me instructing him to make sure you were protected if you turned out to be uninvolved. He didn't play me that part. I know he didn't. We stood there for a moment. Grant, her voice came apart slightly at the edges. I'm sorry, I didn't understand what I was giving him access to. I thought it was just... I know what you thought. She looked at me. You're not going to say you forgive me. Not right now. Right now I need your access card. She held it out. I took it. Then Preston came through the door with 4 men behind him, and everything I had just rebuilt in that room collapsed again. He had Lauren's biometric confirmation, a backup she hadn't known existed, pulled from the system during the earlier chaos. He didn't need the card anymore. He needed her to stop me. 94%, he said, looking at the transfer monitor over my shoulder. 6 minutes. He played the recording for the room, the truncated version, my voice, saying I could remove Lauren whenever I chose. Then he laid out the position clearly. Every document in the Vanguard transfer carried Lauren's digital signature. If he walked out of this building with the data, she would be the only name on it. He would be gone before any extradition paperwork could be filed. She would spend the next decade in a federal court. Unless she helped him finish. I'm giving you a way out, he said to her. Take it. She looked at me. I shook my head. She looked at Preston. And then she handed him the final authentication code. I moved to stop the transfer. One of Preston's men hit me from the left, the shoulder of the wound I didn't have, yet for another 3 seconds until the second man raised his weapon and put a round through the top of it. I kept moving. I cleared 2 of them before the head of North Star's internal security, a man I had personally vetted and hired, stepped up behind me and hit me across the back of the skull with something solid. The floor came up fast. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was the transfer monitor. 97%. I came back to consciousness on the stage. My wrists were bound behind the central podium. My shoulder was bleeding in a way that required attention I wasn't going to get for a while. Preston was standing at the front of the stage in a ballistic vest, the Vanguard transfer device in one hand, a microphone in the other, addressing the remaining hostages and the cameras that were still streaming. He had a story for the outside world. A coup attempt by a shadow shareholder. A violent confrontation he had footage of. A domestic dispute that had escalated into a corporate takeover attempt. He had already filed an emergency injunction through one of the complicit board members, citing a clause in North Star's charter that allowed for temporary suspension of a controlling shareholder's voting rights during an active criminal investigation. People who had bowed to me an hour ago were now looking at their shoes. Lauren stood beside Preston, pale, reading a prepared statement about years of intimidation and surveillance. Her voice was flat, in the way voices go flat when a person is reading words they don't believe while knowing there is no alternative. The transfer monitor visible on the screen behind them read 98%. Preston crouched down in front of me. He looked genuinely pleased. You know what your problem is? He said. He put his hand against my face, not a strike, just a gesture, slow and deliberate. You actually thought being the strongest person in the room meant something. He stood up. At the end of the day, you're still just the man she left. I looked at him. I didn't say anything. Because there was nothing he needed to know. When I had turned that ring 6 seconds before the punch, when Black Seal Protocol engaged, it hadn't only locked the building and triggered the screen. It had done one more thing. A thing I had built into the protocol 2 years ago when I first understood what kind of threat I was dealing with. It had sent a full copy of North Star's internal investigation, every document, every access log, every communication we had gathered on Preston over 4 months directly to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Preston thought the clock had run out on me. He didn't know he had been running out of time since the moment he hit me the first time. There is a specific kind of thinking that takes over when everything external has been stripped away. Not calm exactly, not adrenaline either. Something between the two, a narrowing, where the only things that exist are the variables directly in front of you, and the sequence required to change them. I had lived in that state for extended periods, in places I cannot name, under conditions I will not describe. I had not expected to need it in a ballroom in downtown Washington, but here we were. Preston had left 4 men to watch me and gone to manage the hostages at the front of the stage. 2 were posted at the stairs. 2 more were rotating behind the podium, switching every 4 minutes in a pattern I clocked through my first full circuit of consciousness. My wrists were zip-tied to a support rail behind the podium, standard restraint, effective against someone who didn't have a plan. When they had dragged me up here, the badge had come half loose from my lapel. I had felt it with my fingertips during the first minutes of coming around. One edge raised, the clasp still intact. I worked it free slowly, keeping my shoulders still, letting the activity in the room provide cover for the small movements required. The badge was a Navy Cross citation pin regulation issue, except the rear edge had been precision ground to a fine point by a machinist in Baltimore who asked no questions and charged accordingly. I used it to cut the zip tie. It took 6 minutes. I waited through 1 full rotation after my hands came free. Then I studied the stage lighting grid above me. 4 banks. The breaker panel for the secondary grid was behind a service panel to my left, accessible from the back of the stage. In a building this age, cutting banks 1 and 3 would drop the stage to emergency lighting only, red-tinted directional, deeply inadequate for a room this size. On the 4th minute of the next rotation, I moved. The breaker took 3 seconds. The stage dropped into red shadow. Preston's voice cut off mid-sentence. I was already moving. They moved. Most of them. Some people freeze no matter what you tell them, and you cannot carry everyone. Rear Admiral Harwick did not freeze. He was already on his feet, moving the people around him using the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed in chaos. I caught his eye for half a second as the crowd pushed toward the exit. He gave me a single nod. I went the other direction. I found Lauren at a workstation in the secondary control room on sublevel 1, the room that managed Vanguard's backup server architecture. She was alone. Preston had sent his remaining men to deal with the evacuation. A calculated mistake on his part. He had underestimated how quickly I could get there. She heard me come in and turned with her hands up before she recognized me. Then she lowered them and said nothing. On the screen in front of her was Preston's laptop, accessed remotely through a shared credential he had apparently never thought to secure against her. She had been in it for several minutes. "I found the buyer communications," she said. I looked at the screen. 18 months of correspondence, delivery schedules, payment routing through 4 jurisdictions. And at the bottom of the most recent thread, a single line addressed to the buyer's logistics coordinator, asset Lauren Ellison, to be decommissioned post-transfer. Confirm receipt of contingency authorization. She had printed it. The page was in her hand, and she had been holding it long enough that the edge had creased. I didn't say anything. She looked at the paper, then at me, then at the paper again. "He was going to kill me," she said. Not a question. The flat, factual tone of someone who has just recalibrated their entire understanding of the past 18 months. "Yes. I was never—" She stopped, started again. "He never wanted me. He wanted what I could open." "Lauren, I gave him the code." Her voice didn't break, but it came close. "I gave it to him because I was scared, and I believed him, and I—" She put the page down on the desk. "I need to fix it. Tell me how to fix it." "The Vanguard transfer. Can you halt it from here?" "I have admin override on the backup partition. If I revoke the session authentication, it triggers a full server lockdown. The transfer can't complete without the primary partition, and the primary is already isolated." "Do it." She sat down and started typing. Her hands moved fast and certain across the keyboard, the same hands that had made the wrong choice 3 hours ago, now working to undo it. She cleared the first authentication layer, then the second. Her fingers didn't hesitate. Then the door opened. Preston came in with 2 men and a weapon already drawn. He looked at the screen, assessed the situation in under a second, and lunged toward Lauren to stop her. But Lauren had seen him coming. In the single second before he reached her, she drove her palm down on the final key. The screen flashed red, "Session terminated. Vanguard transfer halted. Security lockdown initiated." 99%. 1 second from complete. The room was very still. Preston looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he grabbed Lauren by the arm and pulled her toward the door. He looked at me with something that had moved past anger into a colder place. "Roof," he said to his men. "Both of them." The roof access was a single stairwell narrow, with a door that opened outward onto a half-acre of flat membrane roofing and mechanical housing units. The city sat in every direction at that height, a grid of light and distance that made the space feel exposed in a way interior rooms never do. Preston put Lauren between himself and the edge. He had the transfer device in his coat, useless now, 99% of a transfer that hadn't completed, meaning he had nothing but the weapon in his hand, was still fully operational. 2 men fanned out to my left and right. I tracked them without looking at them directly. "You want to tell me how this ends well for you?" Preston asked. "I don't need it to end well for me. You're bleeding through your jacket. You took a round in the shoulder 3 hours ago. You're running on whatever keeps people like you moving past the point where they should stop." He tilted his head. "There's a version of this where you walk away. Let me leave. Whatever story you want to tell about tonight, tell it. I'll disappear and you'll never see me again. You'll try to rebuild. Maybe. With technology that belongs to the people who sent those men after my unit for 4 years." He didn't answer. "Lauren comes with me," I said. "Lauren stays until I'm in the air." "No." He raised the weapon and fired. I had read the shift in his weight 2 seconds before he pulled the trigger, the slight drop of the left shoulder, the minute adjustment of his feet. I moved right, closed the distance before he could reacquire, and hit the inside of his wrist on the follow-through. The weapon skittered across the roofing membrane. He was faster than I expected. He pivoted and drove his elbow into my injured shoulder, and the pain was significant and immediate. I absorbed it and kept my hands on him. He got a knife from somewhere at his waist, a short blade, well-maintained, the move practiced, and slashed twice. I took a cut across the forearm, avoiding the first. I caught the second at the wrist, locked the joint, and took him to the ground. I held him there with the knife arm extended and my knee across his back and the roofing membrane cold and rough under both of us. He could not move. I held that position for 3 seconds, then I stood up, stepped back, and let him breathe. "That's enough," I said. He looked up at me from the ground, genuinely confused, like a man whose model of the situation could not accommodate what had just happened. "You could end this," he said. "I already ended it when I hit you in that ballroom." I looked at him. 1 punch was enough to tell the room who I was. "I don't need anything more than that from you." The sound came from the east side of the roof, first rotors, then a second set from the north. 2 aircraft running lights visible, dropping altitude. Preston heard it and understood. The transfer data I had sent to the Department of Defense hours ago when I turned that ring had arrived with timestamps, chain of custody documentation, and 4 months of internal investigation files. The team descending onto this roof was not responding to a domestic disturbance. They were executing a federal counterintelligence warrant. The lead officer cleared the roofline and had Preston in a controlled hold before the second aircraft finished landing. I recognized the man who came through the second team, Colonel Marcus Webb, who had run operational oversight for Black Tide's last 3 deployments, and who I had not spoken to in 2 years. He looked at my shoulder, then at Preston on the ground, then back at me. "You look terrible, Commander." "I've had worse nights." "I doubt that." He handed me a field dressing from his vest pocket. "We got the full package. The Sec Def's office has been moving since midnight." "The transfer didn't complete." "We know. The woman Lauren Ellison, she flagged it internally before it cleared. That's on record." He paused. That matters for what comes next. I looked at Lauren. She was standing near the roof access door, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the federal agents work. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not diminished, just reduced to something essential, like a person who has had every external support removed and is finding out which parts of them remain. She met my eyes. I looked away first. The investigation took 4 months. Preston Vale was charged on 11 counts, including espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and violation of the Defense Secrets Act. 7 members of his network were apprehended in 3 countries within 72 hours of the night on the roof. The head of North Star's internal security pleaded guilty within 2 weeks in exchange for cooperation. 3 board members who had accepted payments from Preston's shell companies were removed and referred for prosecution. The truncated video, the one that showed me hitting Preston, was entered into evidence alongside the full footage, which showed clearly what had preceded it. 2 strikes, deliberate provocation. The deliberate desecration of service medals belonging to men who had died in active duty. The prosecutor declined to charge me with assault. I accepted that without celebration. A decision is a decision, regardless of whether it was legally defensible. I had made a choice in that room, and I was not interested in pretending otherwise. Lauren cooperated fully. She provided every communication, every access log, every detail of her relationship with Preston from the first contact. Her attorneys negotiated a resolution that involved the loss of her position at North Star, the forfeiture of her vested equity, 2 years of supervised terms, and full civil liability for the portion of the data breach attributable to her credentials. She did not contest any of it. She came to see me 6 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital. We sat in the kitchen of a house that had been mine before it was ours, and was now technically both, and soon would be neither. She had lost weight. She looked like someone who had been doing a great deal of thinking and not much sleeping. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without caveats or conditions. She said she had looked at me for years and seen only what was missing, and she had not understood until she was standing in that server room looking at a message from a man who had been planning her funeral, that she had been trading something real for something that had never existed. She asked if there was any version of a future that included us. I picked up her wedding ring from the table where I had placed it the morning after I came home from the hospital. I held it for a moment. Then I set it back down. "I can forgive you," I said. "I think I already have. Not for you, I just don't want to carry the other version." I looked at the ring. "But I can't rebuild something from a foundation that was broken before I even knew it was cracking. That's not forgiveness. That's just choosing not to see clearly." She nodded. She didn't argue. We signed the papers 3 months later. 6 months after the night of the gala, I walked into North Star's main auditorium for the first all-staff address under the reconstituted leadership structure. New board, new security architecture, 2 external oversight appointments from the Department of Defense. I walked up to the same stage. The badge was on my lapel where it belonged. No one in that room laughed when I entered. No one looked past me. No one introduced me as anything other than what I was. I looked out at the people who built this company. Engineers, analysts, program managers, logistics staff. People who had come in every day for years and done their jobs with no knowledge of what had been happening above them. And I said what I had come to say. A title can be hidden. Money can be hidden. What cannot be hidden is how a person treats someone they believe has nothing to offer them. That will always tell you exactly who they are. Afterward, Admiral Harwick found me in the corridor. He was 71 years old and walked with a slight list from an injury he'd taken in the early 90s and never had properly addressed. He had the particular patience of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He asked me if I regretted how the night had unfolded. The punch, the public reveal, the way the thing had broken open all at once instead of quietly on my terms. I stood there for a moment. Through the corridor window, I could see the city below. Ordinary afternoon. traffic on the bridge, people who had no idea that somewhere above them in a building that looked like all the other buildings, something had been decided about what kind of country they were living in. "I regret staying quiet as long as I did," I said. He considered that. "Some men figure that out sooner," he said. "Some never do." He put his hand briefly on my good shoulder and walked away. I stood at the window a little longer. The badge caught the light from outside, that same piece of metal Preston had thrown on the floor, like it meant nothing. It had meant everything. Not because of what it represented about rank or recognition, but because of the men who never made it back, who would never get to stand in a room and be seen for what they were. I wore it for them, too. Here's what I've come to believe after everything. The most dangerous thing you can do to another person isn't to challenge them or oppose them. It's to decide they don't matter before you've taken the time to find out who they really are. Preston made that mistake. Lauren made it too, for a while. And I'm not telling you this story so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling it because I think most of us have been on both sides of that equation at some point. We've been underestimated, and if we're honest, we've underestimated someone else. The person who says nothing at the table. The one in the old suit. The one who never talks about what they've been through. Don't be too fast to decide you know what they're worth. That's the whole story. If it stayed with you, I'd be glad to have you around for the next one. Just hit subscribe, and we'll keep going.